Good news! Oh my god, hey! Welcome back to my Stagey YouTube channel. If you are meeting me for the first time, hello! My name is Mickey Joe and I am obsessed with all things theatre. I am not only a theatre-themed YouTuber, but I am a professional freelance theatre critic based in the UK. And I'm also a big fan of the musical Wicked! Get back, get back, get back. Which is why last month when I went to New York City for the very first time to see over 20 shows on Broadway, I made sure that Wicked was one of them. And a lot of people asked me, Mickey Joe, why are you seeing Wicked on Broadway? You see Wicked all the time in the West End, which is only partially true. But I guess people were curious as to why I wasn't prioritising shows I could only see on Broadway or stuff that had only recently opened. The answer to this is that I was very curious about Wicked on Broadway and how it compared with seeing Wicked in the West End. Are the two shows identical? How does the experience vary? So I saw Wicked on Broadway less than a month ago and I saw Wicked in the West End just last week. And it turns out that while they are replica productions of each other, there are actually a lot of differences. So in today's video, I'm going to be talking you through 10 of the differences between seeing Wicked on Broadway and seeing it in the West End. Now, these are going to just focus primarily on stuff that is related specifically to the show. The theatre-going experience itself differs quite wildly in terms of going to a theatre on Broadway and going to a West End theatre. That's something I'm going to discuss at more length later on my channel in another video, so make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss that one. Now, if you enjoyed today's video, not only can you subscribe, but you can go and find me on other social media platforms. I am at Mickey Joe Theatre on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. And if you hit the link in the description, you can sign up to become one of my channel members. They get to see all of my videos before anybody else, and they get some exclusive content as well. So for a little bit of context, the reason why this is so interesting with Wicked is because it's one of the few shows that has long-running productions on both sides of the Atlantic. In fact, now that Phantom has closed on Broadway and the London production has been slightly edited, the only other shows that I can think of straight away that fulfill this criteria would be The Book of Mormon and The Lion King. In any case, Wicked is celebrating its 20th anniversary this year at the Gershwin Theatre on Broadway, and it opened 3 years afterwards at the Apollo Victoria in the West End. You do the maths, that is a 17-year run. So far, both still going strong. And what's really interesting about this is, unlike a lot of other long-running shows, they are both still in those original theatres that they opened in. Many shows have downsized during their lifetimes, but Wicked still at the theatres in which they opened. And those theatres happen to be some of the largest both on Broadway and in the West End, respectively. Now, a part of Wicked establishing this successful, world-renowned brand is that we're starting to see non-replica productions popping up in places like Germany and in Brazil. For the first time, we are seeing productions of Wicked that break away from the original creative choices. We are seeing different hair colours, we're seeing different costuming, we are seeing Elphaba flying over the audience in different ways. Like I said, these are called non-replica productions because they do not mimic the original production, but the London and Broadway productions are still the same. Allegedly. I'm going to tell you about the differences. Some of these are obvious and some of them are actually quite subtle. A couple of things I should say. Obviously, there will be spoilers about seeing Wicked in today's video. If you don't know about the plot and you don't want to get spoilers, then avoid this one. Also, all of these observations simply came from me watching the show. I haven't spoken to anyone involved, so I dare say there are lighting differences and sound differences and all sorts of technical elements that differ slightly. This is what I was able to tell from the audience. Let's talk about the differences between Wicked on Broadway and Wicked in the West End. So if you're used to one of these versions of Wicked and then you go and see it in the other country, the first thing you'll notice is the accents. With Wicked on Broadway, they use American accents for all of their characters, and with Wicked in London, they use British accents for most of their characters. The exception to this is the Wizard of Oz, who is a canonically American character. He comes from Kansas, as we know, if we know the Wizard of Oz lore, so he will speak with an American accent regardless of which production you are watching. However, Elphaba, Glinda, Madame Morrible, and everybody else is going to use a British accent in the London production. That might be surprising to Americans, but there's nothing specific about the fictional world of Oz that tethers them to a specific location. When Idina Menzel came to London to open the West End production of Wicked in 2006, which I had no idea how lucky I was to see as an 11-year-old, she used her original American accent. She did not speak with a British accent because it's also not integral to the plot that they have British accents. It's just that the performers speak with their natural accents, except when they don't, because in that original cast were some Australian performers. Adam Garcia and Helen Dallimore were playing Fiyero and Glinda respectively, and they went for British versions of their own natural accents. For the most part, this doesn't change anything about the show. I will say that Glinda hits very different in an American versus a British accent, as does Madame Morrible, but we're going to talk more about their characterization differences later on. The one part of the show that jars from me, having listened to American accents on the cast recording, is Bok. In the middle of Dancing Through Life, Bok will sing, "You know what? Let's dance, let's dance." And that jars for me hugely because I'm used to "Let's Dance" from the American cast recording. Now, a few Boks in the UK have been played by Scottish actors, and that avoids this problem. A Scottish Bok would sing, "You know what? Let's dance, let's dance," and it would still work that way. It's not like it breaks a rhyme, it just sounds odd. If you disagree with that one, you can fight me in the comment section. One scene that is staged completely differently between Broadway and the West End is the beginning of Defying Gravity. So the way we enter Defying Gravity in the narrative is that Glinda and Elphaba flee the wizard's chamber and are running up to the top of the building. They are in the attic. And all I had ever known about the staging of this moment is to have Elphaba and Glinda run on and be in the attic, until I went to Broadway and I was sat in the orchestra and my mind was blown, because Glinda and Elphaba come up through a trapdoor on one of those lower portions of the stage that extend out of the front, kind of like a big cog. They open this trapdoor, they run up this set of stairs, and then they are in the attic. This is only a slight difference, obviously, but it just helps to establish that that's where they are and that they have risen to this attic level. Not only that, but that continues to be a factor for the rest of the scene, because Elphaba takes a broom to jam the door. In the West End, she just runs off stage with the broom and then comes back on, implying that she's jammed the door. But on Broadway, oh boy, Elphaba takes this broom, and on the first 3 chords of Defying Gravity, she jams the broom into the door, down in the trapdoor on those 3 chords. It goes, jam, I hope you're happy. Jam, I hope you're happy now. Jam. And on that third one, she finally gets it stuck in place. But that's not the last we see of the broom in this scene. Later on, she uses the Grimoire to cast a levitation spell, and Glinda says, "See, where are your wings? Perhaps you're not as powerful as you thought." And then the broom magically starts to fly. In the West End, this flies on sideways from the wing that Elphaba carries it off, and she just kind of catches it off of whatever is holding it up, because it's not really magic. I'm sorry to break it to you at this point in the video. But on Broadway, because she's put it down in this trapdoor, it flies vertically up out of the trapdoor, which, to my mind, more magical. I mean, probably easier to work out how they're doing it than the sideways one. Like, both equally visually impressive, but to have it flying up and rising and levitating, I think it's just that little bit cooler. Obviously later when the guards then storm the attic, they also come up through this trap door. I think it's just slightly clearer as to the logic of that whole scene. The fact that that's the entrance, we can see it where they're trying to come in, we've seen the door getting jammed, we've seen the broom flying up, we know how this has all happened, rather than having it be off stage in the West End. But I guess in the West End they don't have this trapdoor space to utilise, so that explains why that can't be a part of the staging. Another song in the show where we see some differences is One Short Day at the end of the first act. This is where Elphaba and Glinda go to the Emerald City together, and so we have this big green lighting effect that wows the audience as we arrive in the Emerald City. And in the West End, there are many more lights extending around the side of the auditorium. You get much more of a green light effect when this happens, rather than the one you get on Broadway. But what Broadway has that we don't is a balloon prop that comes down during the Wizardmania sequence. There are lyrics that sing about the wizard in his balloon, and an entire balloon comes down on stage and then leaves again. That does not happen in the West End, and again, blew my mind. While we're talking about flight, another major difference between Wicked in the West End versus on Broadway, and this was the first difference I was ever told about before I saw the Broadway version of the show, is the flying monkeys. Now, in the West End, we have monkeys that fly. Elphaba casts a levitation spell on Chistery using the Grimoire. It's then revealed to her that she gave all of these monkeys wings, and they're all flying around, and we see a little bit of monkey flying. But on Broadway, because of the way that the auditorium is shaped, they have the capabilities to fly the monkeys from side to side over the front of the orchestra, in front of the stage. So the monkeys are flying over the audience. This does not happen in the West End. We see monkeys flying around, but they cannot come as far forwards, simply because there isn't the capability in that theatre. The Apollo Victoria used to be a cinema, so it's not built with those kind of requirements in mind, as opposed to the Gershwin, which was purpose-built to be a theatrical space. And that's kind of crazy if you think about it. One of the Apollo Victoria's previous tenants was Starlight Express, and they managed to race human trains on roller skates around the auditorium and skate up to the circle and then back down to the stage, but they can't fly monkeys over the audience. Like, you can look in the theatre and see why this wouldn't be possible, but it feels odd that they've been able to achieve one and not the other. When the London production opened, they actually used this opportunity to make a few changes to the show that were later implemented on Broadway. So at that time, there were differences between the show that are now not apparent. At the beginning of the show, there used to be this large hat prop before No One Mourns the Wicked. That has since been removed from the show, and they now have this projection of Elphaba in green instead. There's also an entire scene that got added with the West End production that has now been retroactively put back in on Broadway. This happens when Fiyero arrives at Shiz University. His driver Averick nearly knocks down Elphaba, and Fiyero and Elphaba have this whole first meeting where they get off on the wrong foot, which is the whole musical theatre thing of, like, if two characters are going to fall in love with each other, either they will love each other instantly or they will hate each other to begin with. Even then, it's playful flirting because he doesn't recoil at her appearance like a lot of the other students do. He simply walks up to her and says maybe the driver saw green and thought it meant go. Like, he's obviously a massive douche, but there's something there immediately. After the London production opened with this change, it was then put into the Broadway version, but that's not the only new part of the show. In the second act, after Nessa Rose sings The Wicked Witch of the East and Elphaba tells her that she has to leave because she's done everything for her and it still hasn't been enough, she says that she is going back to the Emerald City to go and free the monkeys, and Nessa shouts after her that that's not why she's going. She's going to go and find Fiyero, because Bok has just announced that Glinda and Fiyero are announcing their engagement with a ball. So Nessa invoking the idea of Fiyero wasn't present in the original Broadway production implemented for London, but I like it because it humanises Elphaba at a time when she really needs that depth to her character. Otherwise, we are just seeing her as this very strong and stern witch, as she has been described by the entire ensemble at the start of the second act. We need that moment of humanity from her where we question what her actual motivations are. And it helps to establish this through line of Elphaba and Fiyero's relationship. I've heard some criticism about this line because people think that Nessa ought not to know about Elphaba's attraction to Fiyero, nor should Elphaba know about Fiyero's attraction to her, but I think there's this unspoken vibe at the train station and everyone except Glinda super knows what's going on. And it's the whole thing of you being able to see truths in other people's relationship you can't see in your own. Nessa sees what's happening between Fiyero and Elphaba, but she doesn't notice Bok's enduring affection for Glinda. Here is a random prop difference between the West End and Broadway versions of the show. I told you about Fiyero's entrance with Averick the driver. Now, Fiyero is in this little cart that he is sleeping in, and in the West End production, Averick is just holding the front of it and running around. And in the Broadway production, he has a little horse prop thing or some kind of animal, and he's riding it like a bicycle, I believe. But that came on Broadway, and I was questioning my entire existence because I was like, has there always been an animal there? And no, I went back to the London production, and there's nothing on the front of that cart. So Broadway has this prop. From what I can tell, the US tour doesn't seem to have that either, which makes sense. I don't know that it's super necessary to that moment in the show, but good for Broadway having this random animal prop. Not to overanalyze this completely, but if it is meant to be an animal that he's riding to pull the cart, does that not say something about the way animals are beginning to be treated in Aussian society? Should Elphaba not be visibly annoyed by this and talk about this just as much as she talks about Fiyero nearly knocking her down? She should be complaining about the animal servitude? Or is this a moment of the creatives putting an animal in, forgetting that animals are actually treated differently in this world, and that wouldn't really make sense at this point in the plot? Again, discuss in the comments. From what I could tell, and I've seen the show in London 5 or 6 times now, once on Broadway, I think there is only one line that is different between the two versions. And I may be wrong about this, but on Broadway, when Fiyero storms in and sees Elphaba with the wizard, turns his rifle towards the wizard in order to allow Elphaba to escape, Glinda comes in, sees the commotion, and tries to reassure the Wizard of Oz that everything is fine. Glinda says to the wizard, don't worry your Osness, we all went to school together, which is a slightly charming line, but not nearly as funny as the full comedy line it becomes when she says in the UK, we all went to uni together. And there's something about Glinda, this poised, regal, official, saying we all went to uni together, that just comes across as very funny. I can't tell you exactly why it works as a laugh line, but it does. And we all went to school together feels that little bit more serious, so it doesn't. If she was to say college on Broadway, maybe it would get more of a laugh. I don't know. You tell me. Now, I mentioned before that the accents were different, and there are two characters in this show whose vibes change completely between Broadway and the West End across multiple interpretations and multiple performances. The first of those is Glinda. Glinda on Broadway seems to be a lot more manic, a lot more hyper, and a lot funnier than Glinda in the West End, who by and large seems to be a lot more regal, a lot more poised, and I think a lot of that is to do with the accent. There's something about the change from an American to an English accent that makes the British Glinda just, I think, a lot more stiff upper lip inherently. It's a lot harder to work those jokes into popular when she's still giving you a very posh voice. Popular being the height of Glinda's manic comedy energy in the show. It's still a comedy song in London, but it's not nearly as crazed from what I can tell. There's just a big difference between the depiction of an American high school girl and this like British boarding school girl. British Glindas are over here saying, that's not fair, I told you a really good one, while American Glindas are just screaming, ball gown! Very different vibes. And the UK Glinda has this vibe from the start of the show when she comes down from the bubble and says, it's good to see me, isn't it? No need to respond. That was rhetorical. There's something very Julie Andrews, very Mary Poppins about it all that she never quite shakes, even when she's going back to her younger years. Madame Morrible, meanwhile, I feel differently about, because I think Madame Morrible works much better with a British accent and in the British version of the show. Now, I haven't seen bootleg footage of as many different Morribles to compare the two, but something about Morrible in a British accent giving that speech when she's saying, citizens of Oz, there is an enemy among us. And when she's being condescending to Glinda, it is my personal opinion that you do not have what it takes. She becomes this snobbish pantomime villainess. And on Broadway, she's a little bit more vampy with the American accent, and I just don't know if it works as well. Listen, she becomes a full villain in the second act, giving these malevolent villain speeches, and there's something about a British villain that just hits differently. I don't want to talk about a stereotype of my people, but the British accent just seems inherently more villainous. Am I wrong? I don't think I'm wrong. Another difference between the two productions of the show is actually the size of the cast. Now, granted, I don't know how many of the full listed cast go on for every single Broadway performance, but if you check the two cast lists on each website, there are a handful more performers in the ensemble of the American production versus the English production, and it did look to be a slightly larger cast when I saw the show. Characters like Nessarose and Bock and Madame Morrible have more listed covers on the American website than they do in the UK. Both still have the same kind of general composition. They have standbys for Elphaba and Glinda. There will be a person in the ensemble who covers both Nessarose and Elphaba. There will be additional covers for Elphaba and Glinda. And I believe both still have two Fiyero covers. But there are some other little oddities that make the two productions different in terms of their cast makeup as well. I believe in the UK we have a specific Dr. Dillamond cover, as well as someone who covers both the Wizard and Dr. Dillamond. And if I'm not mistaken, at the recent performance I saw in London, the actor playing Dr. Dillamond also played the witch's father. I don't know if this is a usual part of that track at this point in the show, but that seems to be what happened. For what it's worth, the Broadway cast list also specifically lists who is playing the midwife and the witch's mother and the witch's father and the Aussie official. We don't have any of that in the West End version. In fact, I'm looking at it right now. We do not have that kind of information in the West End cast list. But in the Broadway playbill, meanwhile, let's take a look. We have not only the performers who play the roles like witch's mother and midwife listed, but we also list their understudies. Very, very different. Perhaps this slightly augmented ensemble size is the reason for, thank goodness, in the second act, featuring a few ensemble members on the bridge above Glinda, Fiyero and Madame Morrible. While the West End production has a bridge that comes down, no ensemble members are ever standing on that bridge. I don't actually know if it's the bridge you can stand on or the other bridge in the Flies that I don't think actually has a floor. If it's the second one, then that explains why nobody is standing on it. But that was unusual enough to go to Broadway and see people standing on this bridge where no one's ever stood before. I know it seems trivial, but it's one of those things that just makes you question what you know about the show. So I know I said I wouldn't talk about the general theatre-going experience, but I will just address some Wicked-specific differences. So obviously, in the West End, we are familiar with these large souvenir brochures that have not only information about the cast, but also beautiful, expansive pages with the production photography and other pieces of information about the show, and not too many advertisements. On Broadway, comparatively, you have these playbills. They may seem smaller, but they are free, and that means everyone in that audience knows who is performing. Last time I was at Wicked in London, I overheard some confused Americans who were baffled that they didn't actually know who was in the cast because they hadn't been given a playbill. Playbills feature information about the cast, they feature black and white photography, and also an awful lot of advertisements for other shows, which is how they're able to be complimentary. The souvenirs that you can buy at both productions are largely the same, except for some city-specific merchandise. Right now, I'm wearing my Wicked London t-shirt because it features the London skyline behind the Wicked logo, and similarly, there is a Wicked Broadway t-shirt featuring New York landmarks. I now own that one as well. Many Broadway shows are known for serving themed cocktails in souvenir cups. Wicked offers many of these in New York as well. In London, currently, there are just 2 Wicked-themed cocktails, and they will be served to you in glasses because we do not have the souvenir cups. What we do have usually is interval ice cream, but right now at the Apollo Victoria, this is interval mochi. And one other detail I want to tell you about the difference of being in these audiences is it's customary for Broadway audiences to applaud characters when they arrive, and the show is built around this. Glinda has this moment where she comes down in the bubble and she can pause before her first line of dialogue. We know this because it happened when theatres reopened post-COVID, and the Broadway audience all stood up and applauded Glinda for a really long time. So did we in the UK, and I was at that reopening show, so I can tell you. And Elphaba also has this entrance where she runs forwards on this orchestral swell, and there's a pause before Dear Old Shiz so the audience can applaud, except in London those 2 moments still happen, but it's not guaranteed you will get entrance applause. Sometimes, if there's a really excited audience, but we're just not used to it as a concept. It doesn't mean we're less grateful, it's just not something that we really do. But those have been some of the differences between Wicked on Broadway versus the West End. If there are any I didn't mention, comment them down below and we will discuss. I hope that you enjoyed today's video. Thank you so much for watching. If you did enjoy, make sure to subscribe to my Stagey YouTube channel. Click on the link if you fancy becoming a channel member to see early and exclusive videos, and don't forget to go find me on other social media platforms. I am at Mickey Joe Theatre on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. I hope that everyone is staying safe and that you have a stagey day.
For 10 more seconds, I'm Mickey Joe Theatre. Oh my god, hey, thanks for watching, have a stagey day. Subscribe!